Good morning, everybody. This is Mr. Verzat. Today we're going to cover the ultimate art technique. Now, that's just my opinion. I like to consider it similar to the ultimate martial arts technique, which you could call the death touch, where you can defeat an opponent by hitting a very top secret mythological type pressure point on their body. All right. So applied to art, that means I'm going to teach you a technique that will allow you to create anything. So this is the death touch of art. A technical term you could use to define it as would be basic form building, or another term would be like basic form reduction, to reduce, to take something that's very complex and reduce it down into its most basic components. All right. So you can see that we've got a lot of shapes here. We've got like a sphere, and then another sphere that's been twisted to look like an oval, and then here's another loose, sketchy sphere, and there are a whole bunch of spheres stacked on top of each other. Here we've got a cylinder that's been warped and twisted a little bit, and even down here we have almost like a stick figure looking hand, like here's an elbow joint represented by a circle, we got a hand represented by a circle and some sticks. Okay, well, long story short, this is what artists typically do before they get to this. You see, art is a process, and depending on the process that works best for you or the process that works best for your employer, the success or failure of that art could rest entirely on the process that was used to create it. All right? Well, if you're going to build a building, the process that's used to create it is very important. You typically don't start with the roof first. You lay a solid foundation, and then on that foundation you build up a skeleton and apply the roof last place. And scaffolding is just a tool that helps the engineer or the construction workers access different parts of what they're trying to build more effectively. Here's the Statue of Liberty when it's going through its renovation process. Man, that's ugly. But it's necessary to get to the finished product. So in the same way, if you understand how to take a complex form and bust it into its most basic components, and know how to know where to put those components so that proportion looks good, okay, then you'll understand how to build a scaffold. And from that scaffold, you can work off of it and start to generate the process of creating fully finished artwork. Having a process is very, very important, especially for beginners, so that you guys can learn all of the complexities of creating a piece of art. If I were to teach you how to do all of this detailed stuff right here from the beginning, it would likely fall apart, because knowing where to put the darks and the lights rests entirely on knowing how that foundation of that building is laid and working directly off of that. Now, whether you're a beginner or an advanced level artist, you will still be able to demonstrate this basic technique. The only difference is in the control that you have over your line, the depth and complexity that you can look at something and reproduce it. But ultimately, my goal is for you to reproduce things from your mind and get them on the paper. You see, there's two basic ways to work as an artist. Both have merit, but some are employable and some are not. Okay, so those two ways would be one of the ways that beginners are typically taught, and that would be what's called the hard way. Sorry about the lag here, it's just technical. And the other would be one that's not commonly taught, and that's called the smart way to go about drawing, okay? Or learning any type of craft. So the hard way, what does that mean for an artist? Well, that means, like, let's say you're going to draw, say, like a shoe or a still life thing, and the goal is to create an image from reference, from observation. That is a really ugly shoe, but bear with me. Okay, so technically, you could look at a shoe and recreate that shoe on paper as a drawing. Now, whether or not that drawing turns out to look exactly like the shoe or looks completely different depends on a number of factors, one of which is mileage. If you go and you practice and draw that shoe one time, it's probably not going to look much like the shoe, especially if you've never drawn before. But as you continue to do more and more and more and more and more attempts, by the time you get to like the 100th drawing, chances are pretty good that this is going to look better than this, okay? And that is learning through muscle memory. The question is, though, what happens when you change the subject matter? If you've practiced drawing a shoe, then you're going to go draw, say, like an animal or a tree or a vehicle or an environment. Then all of a sudden you're like, no, you got to go all the way back to square one, because now you got to go through that whole process again. Well, what if there was a smarter way to go about it, where you could draw the shoe and the shoe would come out looking just like a shoe from the very beginning? And even though you continue to practice this technique, once you get to the 100th time of practicing the technique, it won't look much different from the beginning. It'll just look a lot more refined and clean. That's what the smart way is. So let me use the example with the smart way. Let's say we're going to draw something like a triangle. Rather than looking at a triangle and trying to draw it, and then depending on luck or muscle memory to make it come out that way, we study how a triangle is made. And a triangle can fit inside of a box. And a triangle is also symmetrical. You'll be able to draw a triangle and it will look good regardless, because you know how a triangle is made. You know of what it's composed of. You also know that the angles add up to a certain amount of degrees, okay? That's a lot different than going in blind and relying on muscle memory. If you approach art in this way, where you understand function and how things work together, then you can create anything. Now, the same exact process and principle applies. If you take anything, a complex form like a shoe, and you break it down into its most basic pieces, we might have an oval or a cylinder type shape, and then over here we've got an oval at the front, and we can connect them. You understand that this is how a shoe is composed. And if we rotate the shoe, you can rotate it from your mind, because you know that the oval is maybe half as tall as the sphere that's behind it. All right, we could rotate it from behind, because you know those form relationships. And so an artist, a designer, realizes that there's really no difference between a shoe or an environment or a robot or drawing a mouse or a wolf or anything, okay? They all are just a bunch of forms and shapes that can be put together in different ways, and they can be built in three-dimensional space. So ultimately, artists who create original content, work that is unique and that stands out, and also if you're going to go into a career such as illustration or graphic design or concept art or anything, you're going to depend on your imagination for a lot of your subject matter, meaning you might be creating things that don't exist in everyday life. And so where are you going to get that? Well, you need to study, like say if you're going to draw a dragon, you would study the anatomy of a horse by breaking it down into its shapes, okay? And you would study like lizards and bats and a variety of different animals. And then, if you understand those forms and those shapes, you'll have an idea in your mind of what this dragon is, and you can get it out onto the paper. And that's the biggest challenge that beginners often have, is getting what's in their mind out. And the smart way is how you do that. And how you get it out are fundamentals: your perspective, your forms, your lighting, your color theory, all of that. And that's the goal of this skill. We're going to start with something that's a little controversial, and that is we will directly trace over the top of the photograph first in order to understand how to find these shapes. Tracing over a photograph will teach you basically nothing. The goal of doing that is simply to help you identify shapes, all right? The way that you actually learn the death touch is to draw beside the photograph, to draw from observation. And when you draw, you pay very close attention to getting the right size, the right placement, the correct proportions, and so on. And the eventual goal is to get you to the point where you no longer use the stick scaffold, unless you want to. But if you can build with just basic shapes like this, you can create anything at any complexity level, even if it's eyes, noses, mouths. Now, one other characteristic I want you to know is that living things, organic things, typically have ovals and spheres and cylinders as their main shapes that they use. Mechanical objects, then you start getting into your cubes and your cones and still cylinders. Some living things are mostly all cylinders. And you may run into some living things that don't even have a stick figure type scaffold you could start from. There's tremendous variety in nature. There are two types of forms that I want you to be mindful of. The first are direct forms. That would be the literal shapes that you can see in an object. And those shapes are the four basic building blocks that are present in pretty much everything. Those four blocks are the sphere, the cone, the cube, and the cylinder. Now, I want you also to note that these are three-dimensional forms. These are not flat shapes. This is not a circle, this is a sphere, and a sphere has an equator, almost like a globe. A cube exists in perspective. All of these exist in three-dimensional space. Now, your shapes do not stay in this form when you're pulling forms out of living things. These are just generics, okay? Oftentimes, and you'll see it from the images that I had up just a moment ago. Let's go right back to them. These shapes are squished and stretched and compressed. All right, so if you look at the cylinder of this kitty cat's leg, all right, his shoulder joint is at an angle. And so that means the top of the cylinder will be at an angle as well. So you need to mold and sculpt these shapes as you do this. So let's talk about direct forms that we can find in this cat. We can see the triangular cone shape of his ears. We can also see the oval shape of his head. Those are the most obvious. And you may be able to pull out cylinders from the legs. Now, once we get into the rest of the body shape, however, then it starts to get a little bit more tricky. That brings us to what are called indirect forms. These are shapes that you have to make up. And by that I mean shapes that you may have to think a little more deeply about how they're made. So for example, let's look at this hippo's head. How in the heck would you tackle this? You know, we could say this is a big cylinder or whatever. Well, this is where you as the student, what you see may be different from your neighbors, but ultimately the product that you create is going to be very, very close to what you have here. And so me personally, I built an indirect form where I took a globe and I put it inside of the head, just like this, and then I attached an oval to the outside and an oval to the bottom, and then a cone-like triangle in the middle. So that means you have to do a little interpretation. It might take you 2 or 3 shapes to build the overall shape that you need to get to. Let's take a look at a basic structure like a fruit, like a pear, okay? And again, sorry about the line quality here. That's the lag on the computer, so you're really making it a nightmare. So we could take a pear shape and we could start with a small oval and a large oval underneath it. And by combining those two shapes, that gets us the pear shape altogether, all right? Now, indirect forms you can do more with. If we wanted to rotate this pear shape towards us, then we just play with the shapes themselves. So we could rotate it where we're above the pear. So we could take the bottom circle, keep it the same size, push it up, and now we will see more of a compressed aerial look of the pear. Like if this was the top where the stem was, this would now be the top where the stem is. So with indirect forms, you can have a lot more that you can work with. It's just a little more challenging. Another way of doing indirect forms is trying to figure out form relationships. Here's a scaffold technique that's called center. So if you want to know where to place the eyes in a subject, look at your subject and try to find their center line, just like that. And you can do the exact same thing from going left to right between the eyes, okay? And you see I did that with this tiger's face. That's just using a generic scaffold to try to find little relationships between features. Let's try it again. Did you know that we could do the same thing between the eyes and the nose and build a triangle type structure so that we could know where to put the eyes and the nose as well? That's another way of finding indirect forms. So form building, some of the characteristics of what your art is going to look like when you make it like this and you use these techniques is that your line work is light and it's loose. Do you remember the ghosting technique that I taught you, where you ghost and you move your arm, and then you commit to one stroke and drop the shape, all right? That's what you do. There's an element of feeling what the shape will be before you drop it, all right? That helps you to kind of generate a technical word, be a kinesthetic. That's like sensation-based, a feel of what you're creating as you make it, all right? And so you need to practice the movement before you drop it down and move on to the next shape. That is a lot faster, and also your line quality will be better if you do it that way. Your work will have more of a loose flow to it. However, if you like do little sketchy chicken scratches as you make your art, your work will look very stiff and lifeless. So remember, ghost first, drop the shape. If we're going to attach a form to it, ghost, ghost, drop it, ghost, drop it, ghost, drop it, okay? So step one is to use your tool and your arm appropriately. Rule number 2 is your shapes must work together. That means if I draw one shape and draw another, there's not much happening here, all right? These are three-dimensional forms. If there's like a neck behind this figure here, we're not gonna see where that neck connects, okay? So what you need to do is draw through. Have your shapes overlap each other so that you can see all of the hidden edges of the forms that you're going to draw. So if I was to draw like the hips of this animal, I would draw through and try to see where are the hip rotational joints on the other side. Draw through, where's his cute little back knee? Draw through in perspective, there's his foot. Draw through, there's his toes, all right? And we've just created this cute little form. And you can go in and then erase, and now you know that his leg is in proper perspective with the rest of his body. See, I didn't do that with this fella. This leg over here, what I should have done is draw through in perspective to the other side. Draw through, that's where his foot's gonna be. Shoulder, leg, foot. Now we're in proper perspective. So always draw through your forms when you do this. I don't even know what this thing is, but let's just kind of roll with it. And that's drawing through and having your forms work together. And finally, how do you actually build the form? Well, first, find your most direct forms first, and draw those. Typically, I start with the head or the body, whichever is the most effective, and then work your way out. It's a lot more effective if you find things that work as a core. So if we have, say, like a turtle, all right, a good place to start would be his shell, and then work your way out from, like, say, the head. And the head could be a cylinder, or the neck actually, and his head could be a cone on an oval. You can put his cute little eye right there. And when it comes to drawing the rest of his figures, it's up to you. You could start with a stick first with those rotational joints, or you could start with a couple of shape combinations and work your way out, or do both of it. It's entirely up to you how you make that happen. Fourth, indirect shapes. Those are difficult, and let's look at a couple of different animals and see how we can pull those out. Oh, I love guinea pigs. They are like the cutest little fellas. But they are fuzzy, which means we're going to have a difficult time finding where some of these forms begin and where they end. All right, so we're going to have to really interpret here, meaning we're going to have to use our imagination and look at how this fella is standing and come to our own conclusions on where is his shoulder, where's his legs, and all of that. All right, so let's start with his most obvious form, his head. Here's another tip. I would like you to find center for your forms. And on animals, it's very easy. You can see on his little cleft lip right here, I could find the center on that. And then we could infer, like on his nose, infer means to come to a conclusion based on what we're looking at, where his center is here. That helps you get a real nice three-dimensional read on your subject, all right? And now, let's see if we can find any more very direct forms. I'm having a hard time. I see he's got like an edge right here for where his back is, but otherwise, you know, maybe toes, but they're too tiny, all right? So what do? Well, let's take our training and apply it. So here's his fluffy chest, this region right here. This could be an indirect form that we use to build our way up to finishing his body. And then we go to our next obvious shape. He's got this big rump right here, but I really want to use this lower back area. This really defines his form. So you could say that we see his back and his belly, and I'm going to continue that form. All right, draw through, have those forms work together. All right, and then we've got his rear end. Now you could go like this, but we know that there's more to this structure than just a tiny little hamburger bun on there. All right, draw through. Where is the rest of his hips? All right, and you have to kind of make that up. That could be where his little hips are at. And now we go to his legs, which are pretty obvious in the front, but again, we can't really tell where they're at over here. So I'm going to kind of guess that because his fur's popping out, we'll have a shoulder joint about here, okay? And then get your perspective, figure out where everything's converging, draw through. Here's his cute little shoulder on the other side. All right, let's go for his elbow. And then like so, and like so. And then you can use ovals or cylinders. I'm gonna, just for the heck of it, use some cylinders this time, because he's got really skinny legs. You see, that fur is not part of his actual body. We can add that later. All right, we got some cylinders coming at us and then going down, and we got his feet. Now this is going to be a challenge. What do we do here with this back leg? Well, same exact thing. He's going to have a little hip, little knee, little part that curves back, and his foot. And you've just made a very basic structure of a guinea pig. Is it messy? Yep. Is it nice to look at? No way. But it's a start, all right? As you do this, as you practice, you'll get better at it. All right, guys, we're gonna go up a level. And I don't mean to level 2. I mean from training wheel level up to level 1, okay? What we've been doing is tracing. That does not teach you the skill. That teaches you how to find the forms, but it doesn't actually teach you how to do this technique. So now that you know how to identify these forms, what you want to do now is practice rebuilding them from scratch by observation on the side of the photograph reference. So again, just start to ghost. You can actually ghost over the photo if you want, and once you're comfortable with that angle and that size, then you drop it. Again, find center. There's where his little nose is. Let's follow up the bridge of the nose. So you see with the guinea pig, what I'm not doing is drawing like all the fur that's popping out. I'm just focusing mainly on his fluffy little face, okay? Now you see what I'm doing is I'm drawing some kind of incomplete looking shapes. This could be what you would consider an advanced technique where you're only drawing the important parts that you use for your reference. You know, both ways work, all right? So the other question is, how in the heck do you get what you're drawing to match what you're looking at next to it? All right, well, just know that people who've trained for years and years and years and years can do this better than people who obviously just start, okay? Me, I'm nowhere near the level where I can master this one-to-one, you know, meaning like it comes out perfectly. But there are some techniques that you can use to accurately render or draw your subject in proportion, okay? So that technique is called measuring against the subject. You're measuring the subject against itself. What does that mean? So let's take a look at this photo and see what exactly that does mean. So if I were to draw his head, remember his head was the first thing that I drew, and let's say I'm going to draw his leg next, I need to be very mindful of where his leg is in position to his cheeks and his head, all right? So let's look at his eye. If I draw a straight line down, his foot lies directly underneath his eye. So let's check that against my line drawing. Sure enough, his foot lies directly underneath his eye. So when you go to draw something, compare it to something else. If I'm going to draw his behind over here, and I want to make sure that it's far enough away, then one thing I could do is measure the size of his head, and let's take this shape and see how many of his heads he is wide. Let's measure him against himself. So we've got one head, two heads, and then maybe just a little bit more outside of that. Let's measure my drawing. One head, two heads, and then maybe just a little bit more outside of that. All right. So I'm using a unit of measurement that I found inside of the photo, this being his head. You can find whatever unit of measurement you want. Just try to make it, something that's very obvious. You probably would not want to use his eye as a unit of measurement because it's so tiny and it would be so difficult for you to, measure. Now, knowing those forms and their placement and the relationship to each other means that we can take those individual forms, put them to a different angle, and completely rebuild the guinea pig's structure. This is how an artist creates original work. Let's take this cute little form that we've got right here and let's change his body's position. Like, let's make his little head look up like he's trying to get his dinner. I'm still going to leave his big fluffy chest where it was. Let's keep his little belly there. Let's add his waist. And now we've just made another completely original composition from those forms. Let's make him standing on his hind legs. So again, let's draw that head just like we've seen before. So let's draw that head just like we had it before. Let's draw a puffy chest. There's his belly. There's his little waist. And let's have one leg that comes out. Remember, then it goes in. And then he's got his foot. And then his legs are a ways into his torso. They don't bend so much if you ever had a little pet guinea pig. But here's where his nose would be. Here's where his ears would be. He's got his little back arched. There's his cheeks. There's his tummy. And you see, by playing with those forms, we've just created a completely original composition from this photograph. You can practice this for a number of different animals, ranging from, like fish to really challenging forms like this cute little hedgehog. I was being silly there. And even turtles and anything. I look forward to seeing you in class, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.